How's it going, everyone? Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you for joining me. I want to talk today about climate change. Everybody seems to have an opinion on it. If you're on the left, you think that climate change is the greatest threat to mankind and that if we don't take drastic actions in the very near future, we're all going to burn up. Me personally, I'm more concerned about nuclear war. Not that I don't have issues with climate change or pollution. Certainly there are things we can do better as a society to have a cleaner environment. But I'm not particularly worried about climate change destroying humanity or destroying mankind in the next, say, 100 years. Now, we need to go back to and look at where these ideas come from, why people think we're all going to die. And this has to do with the prediction models that they started to produce back in the 70s and 80s, saying that if X amount of CO2 is in the atmosphere, at this point in the future, we're going to see the Earth warm X amount of degrees, the ice caps will melt, several countries will go underwater, and that'll be cataclysmic for everybody, and that will be the beginning of the end. Now, the problem is that these models have never panned out. There are dozens of predictive models that were completely wrong. And yet, for some reason, people don't say, you know what? If they were wrong, maybe we should be more careful before freaking people out and telling them that they're going to die if they don't do X, Y, and Z. But they don't. They keep screaming at the top of their lungs, and we have a whole generation of young people who are, according to some studies, depressed and suicidal because of climate change. We got people screaming at trees. We have a lot of environmental wackos who think that we are in imminent danger of dying. Now, I don't mean to, I just call them wackos, and they're not all bad people. They're very caring, some of them, and they want to protect the environment. And that's a good thing. I'm not against that. Let me be clear. I don't necessarily prescribe to the climate change models, but I do think taking care of our environment is a good thing. But back to those models, we see a similar issue with other models. If you look at the history of economics, you see models that at the time were popular. People thought they were legitimate, but they turned out to be wrong. And if at those times we had implemented solutions or public policy based on these models, that would have been horrible for society. And so let's go back and look at a model. One of those models is from Thomas Malthus, his population theory. Now, Malthus believed that if the population rose faster than we could produce food, there will be a natural check on the population. Because once we reach that threshold where we no longer could feed ourselves, we would have famine, we would have wars, fighting over food, diseases, and that would naturally limit the population. So at that time, he was preaching abstinence. He said, we got to make sure that people don't have too many kids, or else we're going to, in the future, reach that threshold, and that will be a problem for society. Now, imagine if we had actually done that, if we had actually limited the population based off of his model. It would have been a disaster. Why? Because it didn't work out the way he thought. Back when he was alive, there was approximately, I think, about 500 million people alive at the time, back in the early 19th century. And now we have upwards of 8 billion. So why did his predictions not pan out? One main thing, technological change. He could not predict how changes in farming, changes in technology, changing in medicine would allow the population to grow to where it is now, 8 billion people. But if you went back in time and explained to Thomas Malthus these issues, he would look at you like you're an alien. because at his time, he simply couldn't comprehend what the future might bring. So again, there's a huge danger in making public policy off of our theories and models, because if they're wrong, we're essentially destroying ourselves for no reason. Another model, not really a model, more of a theory, Karl Marx. Marx thought that because of this clash between the capitalist class and the workers, that eventually tensions would run so bad or so high that there would be this fight back against the capitalist class, and eventually we would have this revolution that will lead to socialism. Well, it didn't quite happen that way, or not at all really, if we ignore the Soviet Union, which collapsed. So what could Marx not predict or not necessarily see in the immediate future? Well, he couldn't really see how technology would change the standard of living so much that it would sort of undermine people's revolutionary spirit. Now, back when Marx was writing Das Kapital, people were working in factories under horrific conditions, 16-hour workdays, child labor. There was nobody there from OSHA to show up and say, hey, this is not safe right here. We're shutting everything down until this is safe. That didn't happen. There were accidents all the time in factories. It was very brutal. So for Marx, looking at that, he thought at some point society would rebel. The problem is technological change once again. And that technological change raised the standard of living so much that in the 21st century in the West, there's no revolutionaries, per se. We have McDonald's, we have flat screen TVs, we have $1,000 phones, and those are the poor people in our society. The poorest in our society live like kings compared to people 150 years ago. So Marx couldn't see that. Now let's jump to climate change. Before we even get into the models, what are a couple assumptions that we have to make before we even get to that point? The first thing is climate change necessarily going to be bad for humanity? Because that is an assumption that if the earth is a little warmer, that is bad for mankind and it'll be destructive. Do we know that for certain? Some people have said that if we have a slightly warmer climate, that we could actually have more farmland and grow more food. I'm not saying that's going to be the case, but some people, say that's a possibility. The other thing, assuming our models actually could be accurate, assuming that they are correct, will the mitigation efforts actually be worse than climate change? Because if we were to enact some of the most rigorous climate change legislation from the biggest, the biggest advocates of climate change, some of the fanatics, economists go, we would actually starve people to death. We would lower the standard of living for so many people in the world, and for people living right at that line between survival and dying from starvation. For them, it's over. And so we have to ask ourselves, is the mitigation, are the things we're going to do to stop climate change, will that be actually worse than climate change itself? So now let's assume that the mitigation won't be worse. And let's assume that if the planet is a little warmer, that it will be catastrophic. With those assumptions there, now go to the models. Are they accurate? And the problem is they're not. So what do? Well, it's not clear, but I know what you don't do is make drastic changes in public policy that will have a significant impact on the standard of living for the entire planet, based off of models that have historically been incorrect and based off of other assumptions that may or may not be true. That will be, I think, just destructive for our economy and for our standard of living for everyone. Now, So what is the solution going forward? How do we actually combat climate change? Well, the first thing is we have to be very careful. Any change we make, we have to really analyze it and take small steps, not huge steps. So that way, if we start to see a negative effect from a certain policy, we can reverse before it gets too bad. Another thing, we have to remember that long-term, big picture, just like for population theory, just like Marx, what's going to be transformative for our society will be future technological change that we today can't even envision. That is ultimately what will be a game changer. Not putting up wind farms everywhere or solar panels. Nothing wrong with solar panels. I'm not saying you can't do that. But there's something in the future that we can't see yet that will change things in such a drastic way that we can't understand right now sitting here. Just like Marx and Malthus. There's something in the future that we can't see, and that will change everything. And I want to bring up one last thing, and this is a little controversial. Lyndon LaRouche, if you're not familiar with him, he is an economist. He passed away not recently, a few years ago. Kind of a controversial figure. Some people think he's a whack job, and he was certainly eccentric, we'll say that. But he believed in the idea that humanity would progress based off of our ability to extract more energy from a smaller and more dense source. And so what he points out is that if you track humanity over time, we started by burning wood, right? And then after we burned wood for thousands of years, we eventually figured out how to burn coal and use that for energy. More energy from a more dense source. Then it was gas. Then it was nuclear energy in the 20th century. So what's next? If we track that change in what we burn for energy, getting more dense, it tracks exactly with our raised standard of living and economic prosperity. It's science that it will eventually change everything for the planet. So what's next for the future? We don't know. But we need to be careful that we don't limit ourselves and handcuff ourselves based off of what we think might come in the future, not what we know might come. So these models we have for climate change, okay, they can give us some ideas of things that maybe could happen in 30 or 40 years. But to make drastic changes based off of them is foolish. And we have, again, millions of examples in the past of how our grandiose thinking, our models from our smartest intellectuals didn't pan out. And so we can't make that mistake now. We can't make policy based off of maybes. So let's move very slowly. And as our technological situation changes, something will happen in the future, hopefully, that again is transformative for mankind, and we can stop all this stuff with climate change and this doomerism that is going to kill us all, because I don't think it will. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.